On this episode of Doing the Most, we are washing and drying Kveik yeast and giving some away.
Homemade brews and various how-tos, everything from mead to roast, bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.
This process begins with a standard yeast washing. This is Kveik from 3 different batches that we're pouring in here, and this is just a sanitized mason jar. What's going into this mason jar is literally just the slurry coming out of primary. And this Kveik blend is going to end up including Voss, Hothead, and Opshog. Consider it our house blend. Once we have the slurries poured into that first mason jar, we're going to evenly distribute it amongst a few other mason jars. And then we'll top that up with some spring water to dilute it. This gives it more liquid for the active yeast to become suspended in. This helps you separate the lees layer from the yeasty water that you're going to use to harvest your yeast. This is a 30-minute time lapse. After 30 minutes, it will have separated really well. And so you'll want to then pour off the yeasty water so you can begin harvesting the yeast from that. Now those cakes at the bottom are not super firm, so you'll want to make sure that you pour very slowly as you do this. Now obviously I'm speeding this up, so in the time lapse it looks like I'm just hurriedly pouring it in there. The dregs from each of those jars is going to go into another couple of jars and be allowed to settle for another 30 minutes. Our 2 jars of yeasty water are going into the fridge to cold crash for 24 hours. Those 2 jars now settle out, and we can harvest the yeasty water off of the top of those, so we make sure we get as much yeast as possible in this yeast washing. Again, pour slowly, and if necessary, use a turkey baster or wine thief to get every last little bit you can before disturbing the dregs. That jar also goes into the fridge to cold crash. 24 hours later, we've got some really clear water with our yeast settled out at the bottom. We're going to very carefully pour the water off. And yes, there's a bucket off screen here. And we're combining all that yeast into a single jar and adding just a little bit more sterile water. And this is going to cold crash for a little while, 2 to 3 days, so we make sure that the yeast is nice and firm on the bottom of this jar. And at that point, you've got washed yeast. You can portion it out or leave it in that jar until you're ready to use it. However, we're going to be drying ours. And to do that, I'm using a dehydrator. There are methods on YouTube for how to do this in an oven, but that really requires an oven with a fan and an oven that can maintain a pretty low warming temperature. My oven doesn't do that. Fortunately, I have a dehydrator, and I got this at Walmart like 15-20 years ago for 30 bucks. And believe me, for making things like black limes or jerky or fruit leather or craisins, it's a wonderful little gadget. And you can see here that I've actually modified one of the trays to remove the mesh, so I have a little bit more clearance inside at least one of my trays. Instead of using a plate like I'm doing here, you might have to use a ramekin or some other solution if your dehydrator doesn't have the right amount of clearance for a whole plate. We're going to use a finger dipped in Starzan to just lightly moisten the top of the plate, and then cling wrap goes on top of that. And using that little bit of moisture helps us get a nice flat layer between the cling wrap and the plate. Plate goes in, and then we pour off the water, as much of the water as we can get, shake up our yeast, make sure every little bit is unstuck from the inside of that jar, and then pour it onto the plate. I'm putting another tray on top just to put a little distance between the heat element and the plate. And then we're putting that on the lowest setting, which you can see here is 95 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 degrees Celsius. It's pretty cool. So we're gonna leave that for about 4 hours. 4 hours later, we check it and it's pretty darn close, but you can see that there's still some light patches there. So we're gonna let it go for another hour. An hour later, we check it and it is definitely done. You can see that the yeast has dried out and curled up on top of that cling wrap. Then we're going to kind of fold it into a pouch and break up the yeast as best we can to make it a little bit more manageable to work with. Now this yeast came from my camping Kveik experiment, as well as 2 5-gallon hydromel batches. And in the end, after washing and drying and everything, it came out to just a little bit over 4 grams of yeast. I'm portioning that out into 2 2-gram baggies because 2 grams seems to be just about the right amount to get a yeast starter going with dried Kveik. And then I labeled our baggies so I can remember what's in them. I hope this video was helpful if you're wanting to learn how to dry Kveik in a food dehydrator. I think it's the easiest and quickest way of doing it, much quicker than trying to do it in an oven. And it's always handy to have a food dehydrator around. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to give these 2 baggies of dried Kveik away. So if you're interested in winning one, Hit the thumbs up on this video and drop a comment below telling us what you would brew with this Kveik yeast. 2 random lucky winners will be chosen by random draw in the next 2 weeks. If you like content like this, I hope you'll hit the subscribe button, and if you want to support content like this, check out our YouTube member page. It's only $4.99 a month, and your investments definitely help build the channel. You can follow us on Instagram and Pinterest at doingthemostok, and our website is doingthemost.org. Until next time, happy brewing and stay safe.